Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Always Chasing After Something. This will be Part 23, Chapter 13. Izuku's quirk stretched about 10 steps out the door. He knew the moment they crossed the boundary, and it deactivated for a few reasons. 1. The League howled with fury behind them, and their footsteps pounded the concrete floor. 2. A major headache pulsed behind his eyes. Not quite migraine level, but a warning that continued use of his quirk would lead to one. He could even end up with a bloody nose if he pushed too far. That was the drawback of his quirk. The consequences of overdoing it only hit after the quirk deactivated. It was why he preferred short bursts of activation, so he could monitor how his body was handling it. Plus, he'd trained it so extensively, the consequences weren't usually an issue. He didn't hit his limits very often. The last 24 hours had been well beyond the typical day for him, though, so he wasn't surprised his body was starting to rebel. It was simply inconvenient because he was sure he'd need his quirk again before they were out of here. "I hate running away," Bakugo growled. "We have to find Aizawa," Izuku said. They were in a hallway with only a few doors. The first one had been a storage closet, and the second one was coming up. "You'll probably be able to fight then." Was Izuku knowingly about to be face to face with the doctor again? Probably. Was he prepared for that? He was trying not to think about it. Fully aware his preferred coping method was about to bite him in the ass. "Whee!" One of the villains yelled. Izuku and Bakugo glanced back to see the man in the black and white jumpsuit and the man in the trench coat flying through the air towards them. Bakugo braced himself in front of Izuku and spread his palms, letting out mild explosions before they reached them. Izuku bolted for the door, twisting the knob and throwing it open. A Nomu greeted him with a punch to the face that sent him into the opposite wall. Dazed, Izuku slid down to his butt. "Izuku!" Bakugo yelled. The Nomu hovered in the doorway, its huge frame blocking the threshold. He could see elements of a lab between the Nomu's legs and multiple arms that morphed into drills and chainsaws, as Izuku watched. "Don't let them in, 556, an old man called. "My work cannot be disturbed." Izuku stopped breathing. That voice. "Hold still. This'll only hurt for a moment. Cooperate, 84, or do I need to teach you another lesson? Marvelous. Because you lack a quirk factor, you adapt so much better than the others. Wiggle your wings for me again. Shame you're too young to reproduce. It'd be fascinating to study a quirkless fetus against a quirked one, and 83 has been no help there." "Snap out of it!" Pain bloomed on Izuku's chest. He blinked and found Bakugo over him, already turning away to blast the schoolgirl away from them. The Nomu still stood in the doorway, playing defense for the doctor. Down the hall, the League readied themselves for another attack. Izuku trembled worse than a hairless chihuahua in a snowstorm. He couldn't keep a solid grip around his knife, which only made him panic more. Because if he couldn't hold a knife, he couldn't defend himself. And then they'd do horrible things to him again. But he didn't have time to get himself under control because Bakugo was fighting the League right now, protecting Izuku all by himself. And Aizawa probably needed his help if he wasn't already out here with them. But Izuku couldn't breathe or feel his fingers, and black spots pressed on the edges of his vision. "Izuku!" Bakugo barked. He kicked Izuku's leg. "Use your goddamn quirk already so we can get Aizawa-sensei." Use his quirk. He could do that. Make everything around him just stop for a few precious minutes. What an excellent idea. Screw his headache. He could handle more pain. Physical pain was better than whatever the hell was happening with his body. His snap was barely more than a whisper of his fingers brushing against each other. His trembling was so bad. but it was enough for his quirk to activate. Silence rang in the hallway. His panic attack did not freeze with everything else, which was a letdown. And he spent a solid 2 minutes reteaching himself how to breathe so he wouldn't hyperventilate. "Is that you, dear 84? All for One called from his room, nearly sending Izuku right back into his panic attack. His quirk must not stretch far enough to freeze him, too. You really did train that quirk to perfection, didn't you? Nope. Izuku was not going to sit here listening to this. Time to get Aizawa and get out of here. He braced himself against the wall and pushed himself back up, glaring down the Nomu in front of him. I could teach you to do so much more with it. All for One went on. Come back and join us, as an ally this time. Join them? Join them? The man was out of his mind. Izuku was having a panic attack, being in the same building as him. He would never work with them. His legs barely supported his weight as he crossed the hallway, stopping in front of the Nomu. Rotten seaweed and formaldehyde filled his nose, and he gagged, stomach threatening to revolt like it had last night. He had to take a step back and compose himself. I could train you to be a mastermind of the shadows, All for One offered. All you have to do is bring Bakugo back to me. The answer was already a hard no, but he upgraded it to a hell-fucking no at the cost of sacrificing Bakugo to this lunatic. Why wasn't All for One coming after him? Between all those quirks he had, stopping Izuku should be a breeze. It wasn't like his quirk would free someone if they entered the radius after Izuku activated it. Maybe he couldn't. He was hooked up to all those machines. He might not be able to leave on his own. They were due for some good luck. Just think of what you could do with my help, All for One said. They needed to get out of here already, but they had to save Aizawa first. Step 1 was get past this Nomu. Izuku was failing Step 1. Even when he held his breath and stood in front of the being, he couldn't physically move it. It was too heavy for him. Izuku had always relied more on speed and agility over brute strength, and his panic attack sapped what muscles he did have even further. He glanced at Bakugo, and the well-developed biceps under his short sleeves, and the sparks frozen in his hands. New plan. Get Bakugo to move the Nomu. He placed a hand on Bakugo's shoulder and snapped twice. Barely anything in the hallway changed, except Bakugo finishing the attack he started and blasting the lizard and trenchcoat villains away. Motherfuckers! Bakugo spat. He took a second to process the fact that none of them were moving. About damn time, Izuku. The Nomu, Izuku panted, moving aside to let Bakugo past. I can't. Talking was surprisingly difficult when one could barely breathe. Bakugo eyed him as he passed. Izuku, All for One sounded out. Is that your new name? Shut the hell up, you bastard! Bakugo screeched, channeling his anger into an explosion aimed at the Nomu. Izuku winced, wondering how many people had died to make this creature. The blast hit the Nomu in the chest, and because it was top-heavy, it tipped onto its back when it fell, sliding over the floor into the lab. Ah, you figured out how to keep people unfrozen with you, All for One said, clapping like a proud parent. That's wonderful, Izuku. I said shut the hell up! Bakugo screamed. He stomped into the lab, and Izuku got his first real look at what was inside. The tables, the dismembered limbs, that big swinging light. He was on his knees, puking before he knew it, his face mask ripped off and clutched in his hand. Hey! Bakugo called, racing back to him and putting a hand on his back. I know it sucks, but I can't carry both of them out of here by myself. Pull yourself together for 10 minutes, okay? You can break down then. Izuku laughed, a little hysterically. I can't go in there. I can't. Izuku! Bakugo put both hands on Izuku's cheeks and turned his head to face him. Calm down. Eyes on me, you got it? He gasped for breath, feeling a bit like a fish out of water. Fucking breathe, you idiot. What a genius idea. Why didn't Izuku think of that? He scowled at Bakugo, which probably looked pretty pathetic, considering the whole panic attack and gasping for air thing. Bakugo rolled his eyes to the ceiling and took a deep breath. Copy me, you got that? Inhale. Exhale. He exaggerated his breaths for Izuku, keeping his hands pressed to either side of Izuku's face. Unable to look anywhere else, Izuku found himself listening to Bakugo, shakily matching his breaths. All for One called out more taunts, which made his lungs hitch every time. But Bakugo never acknowledged the words, keeping his attention focused solely on Izuku, until Izuku was no longer about to pass out. You good? Bakugo asked. Izuku laughed and squeezed his eyes shut. I need to get out of here. Help me grab Aizawa and Ragdoll and we're gone, Bakugo promised. He misunderstood. Izuku wanted to get away from everyone and everything, including Bakugo and Aizawa and Ragdoll. He wanted to run over rooftops until his legs couldn't carry him anymore, and then curl up in a dark corner by himself, far away from prying eyes and all his problems. He refused to abandon Aizawa, though. If it were just Ragdoll, he might have, but Aizawa had done so much for him. Izuku would never forgive himself if he backed out now. Bakugo helped Izuku to his feet, keeping a hand on Izuku's shoulder all the way to the door. Looking inside the lab again, with the doctor hunched over Aizawa on the table, Izuku balked and spun on his heel, slamming his back against the wall and staring at the ceiling. He couldn't go in there. He wouldn't. Fucking fine. Stay there, Bakugo ordered, stomping into the room. He blasted the doctor away from the table, which was probably unnecessary but extremely satisfying for Izuku to watch. Bakugo started messing with the restraints, and Izuku looked back up at the hallway ceiling. His quirk had been active too long. When he deactivated it again, it was going to knock him on his ass. That was the last thing he needed right now. Still edging on a panic attack and about to be vulnerable as hell with a migraine and non-functioning quirk, he'd only panic more. Aizawa-sensei doesn't look that bad, Bakugo called over. He might be able to walk if you undo your quirk, and then I can carry Ragdoll if she needs it. Izuku pressed his lips together. His quirk would have to deactivate one way or another to leave the building. The physical act of walking past the current boundary would turn it off. But if he turned it off again, he might not be able to turn it on. You need to touch Aizawa-sensei to keep him unfrozen, right? Bakugo asked. Yeah, Izuku responded. Oh, hell. Did that mean he'd have to walk into the lab? All right, hang on. Something shifted around. Bakugo grunted, and then swore loudly. Motherfucker! A cart overturned, metal instruments clanging over the floor. Bodies crashed to the floor, and Izuku couldn't help looking at the source. Bakugo was on the ground. Aizawa collapsed on top of him. Why is he so heavy? Panting, Bakugo hooked his arms under Aizawa's arms and dragged him backwards through the lab to the doorway. Blood stained Aizawa's face, leaking from the corners of his eyes like tears. His suit was intact, which gave Izuku hope that they'd spared Aizawa the worst of it. Hopefully his quirk still worked, but they wouldn't know that until later. A gag was shoved in his mouth, one Izuku recognized. It wasn't to keep people from screaming so much as to prevent them from biting their tongues off, but it also muffled screaming. Let me grab Ragdoll, then do your quirk thing, Bakugo said, turning back to the lab. Ragdoll he was able to hoist over his shoulder, and he came back to the hallway moments later, holding his hand out for Izuku. Well, here was hoping that his quirk wouldn't knock him out at quite possibly the worst time ever. One foot nudged into Aizawa's shoulder, one hand in Bakugo's. Izuku snapped twice. And then he let out a stream of colorful swears, dropping to his knees with his head in his hands. "Izuku, what the fuck?" Bakugo exclaimed. Aizawa let out a muffled noise. Pain radiated in Izuku's head, and something damp trickled from his nose. He hadn't overdone it this badly with his quirk in a long time, and he was still using it. This was great. "Hey, what's going on?" Bakugo asked, crouching in front of him. "Quirk overuse," Izuku ground out. Bakugo swore. "You need to stop using it then." "I'd love to," Izuku spat. "But we're in the middle of something here." "Turn it off," Aizawa said. He rolled over on the floor, movements sluggish and jerky, like he wasn't fully in control. "You'll only make it worse." His words slurred together. They must have drugged him, because nothing in their lives could be simple. If he turned his quirk off right now, Bakugo would have to fight the League by himself. The three of them could barely walk, let alone fight. Plus, someone had to carry Ragdoll. She wasn't frozen in Izuku's quirk, even though Bakugo had been holding her and Izuku had been touching him, but she still hadn't moved. Something was terribly wrong with her. They needed to get out of here quickly. The farther away they were before Izuku deactivated his quirk, the better. Izuku stuffed his face mask in his mouth, biting down on it while forcing himself upright. This wasn't necessarily better than the panic attack, but at least dealing with quirk overuse distracted him from his panic. He was functional this way, and that was what mattered. Bakugo held out a hand to help him up to his feet, which Izuku would not have managed alone. The hallway tilted dangerously, and he took a second to hold on to the wall while Bakugo helped Aizawa up. The man was more mobile than Izuku had thought, but his movements were still clumsy and uncoordinated, and he kept squeezing his eyes shut. Whatever the doctor had been doing to his eyes, it meant his quirk wasn't reliable right now. That could be problematic. "All right, Sensei, you'll hang on to Izuku while we get the fuck out of here," Bakugo instructed. "Leave the fighting to me." While he was carrying Ragdoll, that was asking a lot for him. Aizawa could have done it, but Aizawa had significantly more height and muscle than Bakugo, not to mention years of experience. No one suggested Izuku carry Ragdoll instead. Izuku would have been lucky if Ragdoll's weight didn't crush him on a good day. A heavy hand plopped onto Izuku's head. He jumped, gaze finding Aizawa staring right at him. "We're going to be okay," Aizawa said. "We'll get out of here. Wherever you go, I'll find you again," All for One called. All three of them jumped. "Let's hurry," Aizawa said. Steeling himself, Izuku nodded and pulled Aizawa's arm around his shoulders. Their height difference meant Aizawa had to slouch over him, and they couldn't walk in a straight line between the two of them. But they were walking away from the goddamn lab. Izuku found strength in that and pushed onwards, even after his quirk deactivated and the League rushed to pursue them. Izuku leaned heavily on Aizawa for a while, a pulsing migraine blinding him. His nosebleed picked up speed, trickling over his lip and into his mouth. His face mask absorbed it, and he spit it out once the taste hit his tongue. "Pick up the pace," Bakugo growled. He stayed behind the two of them, covering their retreat with explosions. "Going as fast as we can," Izuku said. They found stairs leading up and stumbled their way to the next floor, which turned out to be the main room of a warehouse. The room was filled with Nomu tanks. Izuku's feet glued themselves to the floor, drawing Aizawa to a halt and causing Bakugo to crash into him. "What gives?" Bakugo demanded. "Izuku?" Aizawa asked. Breathing was difficult. Memories overlapped his sight, blurring until he didn't know where or when he was. "Fuck, not again," Bakugo said. A loud explosion caused them all to stumble forward and the stairs collapsed behind them. "Zuko, we have to keep moving," Aizawa said, attempting to tug him along. "Just close your eyes and go with Sensei," Bakugo ordered. "I'll get you out, I promise," Aizawa said. Izuku clung to his voice. "Keep talking." His mouth was dry and tasted like vomit. "I've been planning different ways to murder the doctor and All for One all afternoon," Aizawa said, and proceeded to slur his way through murder plans while dragging Izuku along. Izuku didn't close his eyes, keeping his gaze trained on the floor to watch their feet. He still had to rely on Aizawa to show him where to go around the maze of tanks until Aizawa abruptly stopped with a bit of a curse. Looking up, he saw a warp gate floating in front of them. Shigaraki and Dabi stepped out of it. Behind them, the rest of the League stepped out of similar warp gates. "Sensei won't be joining us up here," Shigaraki announced. So Izuku was right. All for One was confined to that chair. There was no other reason he wouldn't personally see to this. "But he's entrusted us with making sure none of you leave." They couldn't afford to have anyone know about this location. Either all four of them were recaptured or they'd be killed. "Bakugo," Aizawa instructed. "Start making big explosions, the kind that will draw attention from outside." "Hell yes," Bakugo whispered. He'd probably waited for that command his whole life. Immediately, explosions knocked them around. The tanks on either side of them burst open, green stasis and liquid leaking all over the floor. Dabi threw a wave of fire at them, forcing them to dive to the side. Izuku and Aizawa had to separate, neither one entirely stable on their feet, but they stood a better chance apart than joined at the hip. A girl giggled, and Izuku found a knife-wielding schoolgirl launching herself at him. He caught her wrist and spun her around, slamming her to the ground. He had to keep her pinned for a few seconds because of the wave of dizziness that accompanied the move. "You're kind of cute," the girl said. "I'd bet you look amazing covered in blood." "You're deranged," Izuku stated. She giggled. "My name is Toga. What's yours?" "Ghost." "Ooh, mysterious. I like it. Can I taste your blood?" "No." He pulled out one of his knives and slammed the hilt on her temple. It took 3 tries for her to finally go limp with unconsciousness, and he doubted she'd stay that way for very long, but hopefully a few minutes was all they'd need. Why she'd sat there and took it, he had no idea, and couldn't be bothered to think about that right now. "Toga!" the jumpsuit villain yelled, sprinting towards him. Clones of Toga grew out of the ground as he ran over to them. They melted when Dabi's fire caught on the leaking stasis fluid and sent half the warehouse up in flames. Well, if Aizawa wanted something that would draw the heroes to them, a major warehouse fire ought to do it. "Izuku, Bakugo, let's go," Aizawa yelled. He had a fresh bruise swelling on his cheek as he struggled to fight the lizard villain, the one in the trench coat that was tied up in his scarf already. And Izuku was impressed Aizawa had the coordination to pull that off in his current state. Also impressed Aizawa still had his capture weapon. The doctor must have been so focused on his eyes, he never looked at the rest of him. Bile rose in Izuku's throat at the thought. "Eat shit, handjob!" Bakugo screamed, followed with an explosion. Smoke blocked Izuku's vision, and he coughed, crouching low to find cleaner air. The fire was spreading quickly, smoke clogging up the high ceilings. Bakugo had added to the fire by setting sparks off in his hands and running them over the tops of the open tanks, setting them all ablaze as well. The heat was oppressive. Windows at the top of the warehouse would break any second now. Coughing again, Izuku kept one eye on Aizawa and one eye on Bakugo as they all made their way to the front door. The League followed after them, withholding any attacks for now in favor of escaping the inferno. Twice carried an unconscious Toga. "Sensei!" Shigaraki yelled. "Kurogiri, we have to get Sensei out." Maybe they'd burn to death in the attempt. Izuku could hope. Bakugo blasted the door open. The rush of cool, fresh air spurred the fires on. Flames curled around Izuku, licking at his jacket. "Izuku!" Aizawa called. "Coming!" Izuku responded. It was getting difficult to see with all the smoke and fire, but Izuku followed the trail of fresh air to the door, stumbling over the threshold. The temperature difference almost made him black out. His body simply couldn't keep up with everything anymore. Between his headache, nosebleed, and the panic attack still pressing at the back of his mind, he'd reached a point where his mind had decided, that's enough for one day. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 13 of Always Chasing After Something. The second half to this chapter will be up next. I would love to hear the thoughts and reactions you all are having to this one so far, so drop your comments below for me. Just a reminder, of course, too, that the fic is located over on AO3, so you can slide over leaving comments, kudos, and support to the original author as well. I'm sure it's much appreciated. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.